Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor van Kooten from Canada tonight, who will be talking. He will be talking about the situation in Canada and in Alberta in particular, and the experience of Alberta with renewable energy. We're obviously very curious to hear about what's going on in Canada, which used to be an energy superpower and is working very hard to not be an energy superpower. So Professor van Kooten is an environmental economist at the University of Victoria, and he received his PhD in agriculture and resource economics from Oregon State University. He's also the Canada Research Chair in Environmental Studies and Climate. He's been working in this field of environmental economics for more than 30 years, has published 100 or 200 papers, I can't remember, lots. And some of his books are kind of standard works on the economics of the environment. He will be talking to you for roughly 40 minutes, 45 minutes, then we'll have another 45 minutes of Q&A, so we'll have plenty of time to discuss. But please welcome Professor van Kooten.
I'm up now for over 27 hours, I think. Got on a plane early this morning in Victoria. Beautiful takeoff and landing because you go over the ocean and all those mountains and everything else. And then from Vancouver, it's a solid 10-hour flight. And then getting around London, I'd been in London once when I was visiting Cambridge, where I'd been 3 times. And I managed to take my wife one day. We went by train into London, and that's my experience with London. It's a very, very confusing place, to say the least. Now, I'm not really an environmental economist, I hate to tell you. My area is more forestry, agriculture, and energy, and I've also done a lot of wildlife economics, but my first degree is in physics, so I understand a lot of the stuff that's going on here. And when I took the Canada Research Chair position at University of Victoria, they put it in such a way that it was environmental studies and climate, not climate change, and climate. And when I came there, there was some expectation that somehow I had to be involved in climate of some sort. So I first hooked up with the climate modeling group, the climate scientists, and ended up, I don't really want to work with these guys, and ended up working with the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems with the engineers, where I found a pretty good home for a number of years. I've been with them now for 15 years since and with the University of Victoria for 16 years. So that's been my background on this energy stuff, even though my first attempt at it was working on the coal industry in Alberta when I was doing my master's at the University of Alberta. And that was quite a while ago. So I was eating a waffle just before I came here. Benny was going to take me for lunch, but we were so late getting off the plane and getting to the hotel and everything else that he went off, and I got changed and went and had a waffle. And across the street, I saw a sign. And the sign said, free beer, topless bartenders, all right, and false advertising. And I thought to myself, you know, that's the perfect way to describe wind, biomass, and solar renewable energy. All right, so given that I have such a short period of time here, I thought I'd go over it very, very quickly. So you're all familiar with the story of how we got this 2 degrees, and we're all trying to get down to a global 50% reduction in CO2, impossible. 80% reduction, start walking, get rid of the tube, get rid of flying, get rid of everything else, because about all you can do is agriculture at 80%. And one of the things that we know is that global consumption by energy source just keeps going up. All right, about the only one that really hasn't been doing that much is hydro and nuclear because of the attitude towards that. If you're going to go carbon-free, you've got to go nuclear. That's my message, all right? And that's the conclusion from all of my research. When we look at the U.S., yeah, it's flattened off a lot of what's going on. The same thing with the European Union. It's really not increasing, but it's not declining much either. It'll probably increase a little bit over time. But the big story, of course, is China and India. And anything we do here, if we reduce 30%, they'll make up for it within a couple of years. All right, so anything we do is just a waste of time. All right. But my big issue deals with three things. Biomass, which I'm going to talk about first, because everybody is trying to substitute biomass for coal. All right. And a few years ago, a Cambridge consulting outfit called me up, or they sent me an email. They don't call anymore. And they asked if I would do a study for them. They wanted to know, and this was a study that was done and a proposal that was put out by, is it called the Climate Ministry or something that you had at that time? It's changed since then. Yeah, I know it's changed, but that was the ministry. They'd done a report, and they were interested in knowing how much timber the Pacific Northwest of Canada could supply to the UK. And admittedly, we're exporting around 2 million tons of pellets, all right? And they asked, first of all, how much timber would there be if you took all the coarse woody material off the forest floor? I didn't realize this. I had sent it, I'll come back to it. I'd sent this on to a colleague who was desperate for some money. I said, do you want to do this with me? And she came back and she said, did you read the proposal? I said, no, I really didn't read it. They want to know how much timber we would have if you took all the coarse woody material off the forest floor. And then they wanted to know how much timber they could get if they took the coarse woody material and the fine woody material off the forest floor. And I got thinking, they have no idea what's going on in our, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute. We take the stuff out of the forest, bring it up to where we put it on logging trucks, and then we cut the material, all right? So these are logs that have already been trimmed of all their leaves or their branches and everything else, and all the logging residue is sitting there. And what happens is it gets to where they're loading the trucks, and they got to fit the logs on, so they create a lot of roadside waste. What do they do with it? They burn it on site. All right. They don't haul it off to a mill. Why? Because it's a 9-hour round trip for these trucks. 9-hour round trip means that fine, coarse roadside waste is too expensive to haul to a mill and to use in burning to make electricity, let alone make wood pellets. So where do wood pellets come from? Well, the idea is to get all that fine and coarse woody material, because otherwise you're cutting whole trees, and that's really bad, all right? So the idea is it'll come from lumber residues. Fine. How do you get to pay for this? Well, we're going to subsidize it. Well, that's going to raise the price, and you first have to outbid the pulp people, the oriented strand board people, what's the other one? Medium density fiberboard people, and the on-site generators of electricity to run the sawmills. All right. So we did one study, and we found that the price that you would have to pay here in the UK would triple, essentially. All right. So if you wanted that. Well, what are the Americans doing? While they're in the South, they're selling you a lot of this old growth timber that's sitting in everywhere, right? And it's an ecological disaster there, because it's all the stuff that sits in these swamplands and everything else. Once that runs out, the mandate of the EU is you have to get the timber from a forest certified place. Not very many sites in the US are certified according to FSC, Forest Stewardship Council standards. So the Canadian ones are, the American ones aren't. All right, so that's the biggest problem. And now you've also got competition from Ontario for that fiber because they've converted their coal-fired power plants, not all of them, but they've either eliminated them or converted them. And now Alberta and some of the others. And the Americans are going that way. So there's going to be a lot of competition for all of that fiber. All right? Well, here we go back to, the expansion of, this is what's under construction now. All right, 559, and I'm digressing. I want to get to this, this other stuff, the biomass story. All right, so here's a picture of what happens on the forest floor. And you see this stuff here? Some of that'll be trimmed. You see logs like this where I live. I live about 100 meters from a park, and I see this kind of stuff laying all over the place, this kind of stuff here. And you're not allowed to touch it or remove it from the forest because it provides habitat for all kinds of animals and bugs and everything else. All right, so here you can see this kind of stuff is what they mean by really coarse woody material. All right, it's all around that guy. That, I tell you, is not being hauled to any mill. Here's how they pull it out, and here you get to the roadside. So these kind of cranes haul it up from down below, bring it up to the roadside. And you see all this mess here? It's all coarse woody material, and if you go walking through there and you lift it up, there's all little trees growing. It's amazing. It's amazing how fast these trees come in. They're already growing by the time you're cutting everything else. Here's a steeper site here where they're yarding the equipment. Here's on flat ground. Sometimes on flat areas you can do it, all right, if you have the roads close by and the mills in place. All right, more of this coarse woody material, and here's where they actually load the trucks along here, and they leave all of this stuff, just either they burn it or they just leave it. See, because they have to fit these trucks perfect to carry the logs. If they can't do that, then the expense of using that truck, it makes it uncompetitive. All right? And of course, you have to have these trucks, they're coming down the road at you, so you have to be a little bit careful when you see these trucks on the road that, they have to meet certain standards as well. All right, so the big debate has been about this life cycle analysis of carbon. All right, and I'm just going to point out a couple of things. So if you take pellets from standing trees, it takes 38 years to eliminate the carbon debt. And I'll show you what I mean by the carbon debt in a minute. If pellets come from forest residues, 16 years. But remember what I told you, it's too expensive to get the residues, so it has to come from sawmill wastes. All right, other studies have found the same kind of things where they get these what they call global warming potential values between 0.16 and 0.86. If they're above 1, that means that burning wood is worse than not burning. It's worse than burning coal. All right? So these aren't doing that well, and the reason is very simple. All right? Here's how it works. So if you're burning fossil fuel, say coal, this is how much carbon you emit into the atmosphere. If you burn wood, then at that time zero, when you burn it, this is the carbon debt that you establish because it increases CO2 output compared to what coal does. All right, and if it's natural gas, the debt is going to be even bigger. So you first have to eliminate that debt, and then to make it neutral, you get out here to time n. Do you ever get there? Well, you could 80 years from now, 100 years from now. All right, depends on how long it takes to grow. So those are the trade-offs here. Now, the question is, how fast does this occur? Well, does it matter to you and I whether this occurs early on or late? Think about it. If climate change is urgent, that we have to address it and mitigate it urgently, then we don't want to delay this down the road. All right? Now, if you have an urgency, you want to discount future carbon fluxes. So anything you take out of the atmosphere or emit into the atmosphere, you want to discount it highly. because you're interested primarily in what's happening today. Okay? So what happens is you have to implement a discount rate. And if your discount rate is very low, there's no urgency in addressing climate change, then it fairly quickly you might, depending on the kind of trees and everything else, you might eliminate the carbon debt and even go and eliminate CO2 emissions entirely. In other words, become carbon neutral. However, if there is a great urgency, then that debt is never removed. So in other words, burning coal is better than burning wood. And people forget that because the legislature says it's neutral. Burn wood, no carbon emissions. Well, no, you do have carbon emissions. So here we've done a couple of studies with white spruce. If you discount it at 0%, then it's very quickly, it's this line here. You can't see that very well. At 1%, it's this, you don't eliminate it. In other words, it's not neutral. And at 5%, you basically never get rid of the debt. Okay, that's if it's white spruce. Lodgepole pine, same kind of thing, all right, at 5%. And 5% is not very high, all right? And if you have hybrid poplar, then you can eliminate that debt completely very quickly, but even at 20%, say, which would be a great deal of urgency, you never really benefit and make it carbon neutral. All right, so that's, we've done quite a few things about that. And the big thing is, and I've always argued against using carbon credits from forestry. All right, and I can give you some examples and I can give you some papers that I've written, because you can justify almost any forest use, any activities, and thereby gain carbon credits, and it leads to a tremendous amount of corruption. That's what I have against them. So let's jump to wind and solar. All right, well, everybody knows that intermittency is your big problem. So if the wind speed increases from 10 to 20 miles per hour, the power increases by a cool factor of 8. If wind speeds drop by from 20 to 10 miles per hour, the power produced drops by 87.5%. So a not unreasonable drop in wind speed results in a huge drop in power production. All right. US econometric studies, and I list a couple of there, and they're supported by work that I've done using mathematical programming and other technique. They indicate that when wind displaces anything, it displaces natural gas, not coal. That's the tendency. So in other words, when you bring wind in, you substitute for peak power and not for coal. We're going to look at Alberta as an example, but the take home here is that you're basically, wind is getting rid of peak power, which means that the incentive to produce peak power is gone. So there's less investment in peaking plants, natural gas. All right, so we know where Alberta is, I hope. All right, and I spend most of my time right here now. And I've worked also at UBC and down in Reno, and I've been on faculty, and I've been forced to retire from the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. Here's some background to management. So the one thing I want you to sort of note here is these capacity factors. So what it is the actual amount of power generated in a given year divided by 8,760 hours in the year times its rated capacity. So capacity factors for solar rarely exceed 15%. The Germans are running around 11%. We're getting as high as 12% in southern Alberta. Wind runs, good wind plants will run 25 to 30%. The odd one will go higher. All right. Now, when you're looking at nuclear power, you want it to be about 90 to 95%, and coal runs at about 85 to 90% capacity factor, and that's the reason we like nukes and coal is they're reliable as can be. All right, I don't know if you are interested in this. Basically what happens is you create a merit order. Your demand curve where it intersects that supply curve is where the price is. So a coal plant, a nuclear plant, any baseload plant will bid in at zero. So at zero, it's always taken, which means it's going to get whatever price the market gives, because the high cost is the fixed cost, not the variable cost. Okay? The other plants are marginal. Now what happens is when you get wind in there, this is what happens when you get demand out here. You have these blackouts or brownouts, and you have what's called the missing money problem. In other words, the price never gets high enough to be able to pay for these peaking plants. Okay, so when you get wind in here, what it does is it shifts that merit curve, the supply curve, to the right, and that means that you're giving, wind is taking the place of some of these baseload plants. So the baseload plants have to adjust. All right, in other words, they go from capacity factor of 85, 90%, they go down to a capacity of 70%. All right, now that's not bad, except when they do that, they're less efficient and it costs more to generate electricity. And that's the problem. All right, that's something never spoken of when we talk about wind and solar. The fact that you're affecting these other power assets, these other generating assets, and their costs go up. All right. I'm going to ignore this. This is the background to the work we've done. All right. Let's see if there's anything interesting on these slides. This is the installed generating capacity for wind in various countries. And you notice China is leading, US next, Germany, and then even the Netherlands is here. UK is down here, and it's getting capacity factors onshore of 26%, 35% offshore. Denmark has been hitting 41% offshore, sometimes even 50%. All right. Now, I'm going to show you something in Alberta. We've hit 75%, and it still doesn't help. All right. When we talk about solar generating capacity, there's even more generating capacity because this is gigawatts, and the other one was megawatts. All right. So there's even more solar generating capacity in the world than there is wind generating capacity. The problem is you see that these carrying capacity or these capacity factors are quite a bit lower. And it's only in certain regions of the world where they're good. So here's Alberta. We have an intertie, a big intertie with British Columbia, which operates at about 1,000 megawatts. The two provinces are in a battle over pipelines, but they're also in a battle over power. All right. Alberta does not like the fact that it sells power cheap to BC at night from solar and coal, wind and coal, and then buys it back more expensively during the day, and it's trying to avoid that. It built a line, a 300 megawatt capacity line into Montana, and it has a small one in Saskatchewan. But we're going to ignore most of that in the kind of stuff we're doing. All right. We want to see, because the socialist government in Alberta has recently passed a bill saying that they want to get rid of all coal-fired power by 2025, which means closing down some pretty big coal-fired plants. And you'll see that right here. This gives you an idea of hourly wind and solar profiles for the area I'm going to talk about, which is Pincher Creek, which is in the southwest, which is the only place which yields capacity factors for wind in the range that makes any sense. They're over 30% there. All right. But you see the black line is your wind and your solar is your red line. And there's really no pattern there that's discernible other than that with the solar. You can see that it's daylight hours. Load duration curve, here's the programming model. I'll just skip through that. This tells you what we're up against. So coal, this is the capacity, all right? 6.3 gigawatts of capacity, natural gas 7, but coal produces the most, 55%, followed by natural gas. So we're at 90% coming from that. All right, wind has creeped in, 4%, all private investment. Guess where it's all located? Pincher Creek area, right off the Rocky Mountains there. Biomass, this is mainly burned in sawmills, all right, some up in the oil sands, and other doesn't even rate, all right, and we have very little hydro. Notice that we're talking about since 2000 that there's been new investments in coal, all right. In fact, coal capacity has been increasing. It declined a little bit. It also declined in this area, but there was new buildings going up or new power plants being built at the same time. So the government's going to have to pay off these coal-fired power plants. Here are some of the capital costs and operating costs for different assets. Really, they don't make that much difference, all right? What the actual numbers are, you can put those solar and wind numbers pretty low and the nuclear numbers and that pretty high, and the pattern doesn't change that much in what you're generating, and that's a real shock to me. And it's got to do with the stability of the whole system and how it operates. All right, so what we did was we scraped data from Environment Canada's website on solar energy and wind energy, and we got 10 years of hourly weather data from 2006 to 2015. We then created wind data and separated it into 3 regions, and this is what it looks like when you do that. So this is the potential average hourly energy output megawatt for one 3.5 megawatt wind turbine. All right, this is the potential average hourly energy as a, okay, this is a 1 here, this is 1.5 up here. Notice that you rarely get above, so this 3.5 megawatt turbine is rarely averaging more than about 1.4 megawatts per hour. And this, of course, is our Pincher Creek area. All right, we did the same kind of, we also looked at the proportion of time that a wind farm, if you took it from all across Alberta, the proportion of time that it would be less than 1 megawatt being produced out of this 3.5 megawatt. And you see here that that's the big thick line. Most of the time you're under 1 megawatt. Sometimes you're between 1 and 2, and most of the time you're much lower. All right, you're quite often, or 2 megawatts rarely shows up. We did the same thing for wind, all right? And notice that we're doing it for 10 years, right? So we're going to have 10 years of data, and we're going to run each year separately. And we're going to see if you impose carbon taxes and everything else, whether or not, and what would come out of it. All right, so what we did was when we put in a tax of $24 US or $30 Canadian, which is the new tax that the Alberta government put in, you see that there's no, except for one instance, you don't even have the incentive to put more wind capacity in. All right, all you're doing is you're shifting from coal into gas. All right, and your emissions of CO2 are going to vary, but they don't change all that radically across years. All right, now if we put in a carbon tax of $200, all right, into the same model, then notice what happens. All right, you do get wind, but only for some years. All right, most years it's not profitable to put wind in, so it depends on what year you pick. All right, you can cherry pick the wind year and argue that, yeah, we need to install a lot more wind. But if you pick another year, you find the opposite. And what you find is, so these are your capacities of wind, and remember we've got a starting wind and an ending. Pardon me, I'm missing, this is a battery. So here we're trying, somebody said to us, oh, you need to include a storage battery. So we put in a storage battery, and this is how big they have to be, okay? If we allow gas and into the mix. All right, no nuclear, and we reduce, only for these years can we reduce our CO2 emissions. So let me just back up, so I got this straight for you. In this slide, we're looking at a $30 Canadian tax of CO2, and we don't bring in any new wind except there. okay? But we already have existing wind, all right? And that, pardon me, we do have existing wind, but we don't bring any new in. These are my peak gas plants. These are my capacity factors for those. Look how low they are, all right, for peaking plants. These are my base load gas plants, and these are the capacity factors for them, very high, because we've taken the coal out. All right, net emissions haven't changed that much. So now if we increase that and we add a battery possibility, storage, well, we find storage is only useful on some occasions, in some years. Often you don't need it. So then we decided, okay, what happens if we don't allow any fossil fuels into the mix, just wind and solar? What would happen? Well, it turns out, very interestingly, that the battery has to be so large. I'm trying to find the slide now where we talk about, oh yeah, Elon Musk offered to build a gigantic battery of 100 megawatt. Now you have to look at a battery. It has two capacity ratings. One is the capacity in megawatts, but that doesn't tell you how much is stored, all right? You need to know how much is stored. For example, a little battery will have very, very low capacity factor, okay? But it can produce a lot of electricity over time. So you really need to look at this 129 megawatt hours of capacity in the battery. And that was how big the capacity was. If your hourly load is 10,000 megawatts, that capacity, that gigantic battery would provide less than 1 minute of power. All right, so in other words, if Alberta had that kind of battery in its generation mix, it wouldn't last more than, it'd give us maybe a minute, all right, to adjust to any loss in power. All right, so that's the problem. Now, how big a battery do you need to run the Alberta system? Well, I've done a few runs. This has been one of my higher numbers, but that's measured not in megawatts, not in gigawatts, but in terawatts. Well, there's no way you're going to build a battery that big, all right, because it'll cover most of the cities of Alberta, you know, in area, let alone the problems you're going to have. Some more recent results where I've allowed a little bit of gas into the model, all right, I ended up with, I think it was 146,000 megawatts. So we're talking about battery sizes that are simply unrealistic as can be. And I was in touch yesterday, just before I left, with my PhD student. What we've got is a model that joins Alberta and BC, where we're modeling the hydro reservoirs in British Columbia and the wind that's coming up in Alberta. And what we're finding is that when you put in a larger intertie between the two, Alberta reduces its coal-fired power. But the percentage of coal in the generation mix increases. Why? Because Alberta simply buys cheap carbon-free hydropower from British Columbia, all right? Whereas before, it would sell at night. Now it would buy less, or sell less at night and buy more during the day and when it was needed. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about Site C, which is basically what it is. You've got the Bennett Dam and a huge reservoir behind it, which is the biggest reservoir in the province. And then you've got another reservoir below that, which is basically, it's called Canyon, Peace Canyon. And it's basically a run-of-river reservoir. In other words, when you run the big reservoir, you've got a day or two, and then you have to run the lower reservoir. And all this Site C, where all the controversy has been, is a third downstream, or a second downstream and a third dam on that same system, where you'd have basically a run-of-river, where it would hold storage for a day or two, maybe 3. So the story here is that storage doesn't help that much. Battery, so this battery I'm talking about is just a black box, right? I'm not even charging. As soon as I put a price on using that battery, it disappears from my model. All right, so this is free storage. The other thing we find, and this was a bit of a shock the first time I encountered it, was when we allowed nuclear power into the mix and we had high carbon taxes, we found that the only way Alberta, and I think it's on one of these slides, let me just go back up. Yeah, if you look here, so what we had was no nuclear energy, and forget the coal to gas conversion, that's turning out to be a bit of a boondoggle, we don't really need it, all right? But when we put a carbon tax of 0, 30, and $100 on Canadian, we'd really get some benefit in terms of reduced CO2 emissions, mainly because of the switch that the US has been doing as well from coal to gas. All right, but we've also seen in some scenarios an increase in wind. Solar doesn't come into the picture. Why not? Because you're putting solar panel on agricultural land and you have to pay a rent. All right, and when you pay that rent, solar is out of the mix. It doesn't even compete, despite the fact that panel prices are going down like crazy. All right, and everybody says, oh, put them on the roofs. Yeah, I've seen a lot on London roofs. I think I saw one off the train that I was coming in at from Gatwick. But when you put in nuclear power, but you need a high carbon tax. All right, and the reason you need it, of course, is because of the higher cost of nuclear to overcome the waste problems and everything else. And don't forget that solar has a huge waste problem as well. Okay, those are rare metals, heavy metals, and they're after 30, 20 years, you got to get rid of those as well. So that's a problem. And of course, wind. What are you going to do with those huge concrete blocks that are sitting to keep those towers steady? All right, they have to be gotten rid of as well. But when you put in nuclear, all right, so I don't care what that happens because it comes in at 150, but notice at 200, we're down to well below the 80% target. So folks, if you're going to do 80%, you got to go nuclear energy. All right. Now, the thing is, the interesting thing that we found was, guess what benefits nuclear energy as opposed to wind? Nuclear energy outcompetes wind and solar for storage. Okay, think of it this way. You've got, your level is, this is your base load. You always have to meet it every single hour. Normally a base load plant would not be bigger than that. So think of it, nuclear power that big, no bigger. So all the rest has to be met with wind, natural gas, anything else, right? Hydro. But if you've got storage, you can up that nuclear power, that nuclear capacity somewhat. Every time that you're at base load or below that capacity on nuclear, that little bit you can store and then sell it again when you're above that nuclear base load, okay, or the nuclear capacity. And then nuclear energy outcompetes wind in that department. And we first discovered that when we did the intertie with British Columbia. All right, we suddenly found, whoa, nuclear's using that intertie. And even coal will use the intertie and beat out wind unless you have a high CO2 price. Okay, let me finish. I'm running out of time, right? And you probably want a lot of questions. Oh, we're going backwards here. I think I have some conclusions. Yeah, so countries cannot reduce anthropogenic CO2 emissions by 50% or more without nuclear energy. Biomass energy is a non-starter from the get-go. I'm surprised that the UK ever jumped into this, and my country, the Netherlands, as well. The EU predicts that if you're going to go with renewables to the extent they want for 2030, half will come from burning of wood biomass, or will need to come from that. And my results indicate that solar and wind would be unable to replace 2/3 of coal-fired generation in Alberta as required by government policy, and deployment of nuclear power can decrease CO2 emissions by as much as 97% in Alberta, compared to only 56% would be the utmost we could do with solar and wind, and then we'd have all kinds of grid instability problems nonetheless. And if you have battery storage, nuclear energy outcompetes wind and solar for that storage. All right, there's a lot more underneath there, and there's a lot of other issues that we're dealing with in Western Canada particularly. We have two socialist governments duking it out in the courts to see whether or not a pipeline that had been agreed to by a previous government, which is a mess. Anyway, thanks for listening.
Good.